Global Crew. So last time we talked about the age of exploration. We talked about these Europeans going out to see the world and see what else was out there. Well, now we begin to answer the question of, well, now what? Once we find out that there's this continent called North America and this continent of South America, what happens next? And in particular, what are the Spanish going to be doing about it? Because the Spanish are going to have a relatively violent take on this whole thing. So today we're going to be talking about what happens when Spain heads to the New World. So our two questions there: how did the Spanish come to dominate the New World so easily? And then secondly, how did society and culture change in the New World as a result of the Spanish conquest? So again, we looked at this age of exploration. We talked about Portugal trying to find this new route to India via Africa, or at least going around Africa. And of course, people like Columbus will say, well, let's just go in a different direction and ultimately stumble upon these two new continents. And even though we have had these big civilizations like the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca, this is about to change. So as Europeans are learning more and more about the world and what's out there, they realize that they want to control more of it. Certain countries in particular, but they realize, there's wealth out there. There's things to be had. There's value to gaining it. And so Spain especially felt this way. And so from a pretty early period, the Spanish, who for centuries had been fighting to take back their country from the Muslims, they had kind of gotten a little bit ethnocentric and almost kind of racist, and also fiercely Catholic. But they kind of begin to decide, the rest of the world can be ours as well. And so Spain begins to send these military folks into Native American populations, and we call these we call these Spanish military leaders conquistadors. It literally just means conquerors. But a conquistador is going to be a Spanish military leader. They're going to be sent to the New World to try and find wealth for Spain. And they're going to find a whole lot more than wealth, as we'll see. Now, many of these conquistadors originally came from areas of Spain that were relatively poor and agricultural, and that's certainly true of the two guys that we're about to talk about. But, being from poorer, humbler backgrounds, a lot of these guys want more. They want more wealth out of life. They want power. They want influence. And unfortunately, they're willing to do just about anything to get it. So one of the cruelest conquistadors, and certainly one of the best known, is a guy by the name of Hernan Cortez. And Cortez starts out as a relatively unassuming military officer. He's stationed in Cuba, which was very quickly taken over by the Spanish once they found that island. But in 1517, Cortez actually went against the orders of his commander and took several ships and a number of soldiers and landed in Mexico. And as soon as he got into Mexico, he started hearing stories about this Aztec empire. So he actually found himself a translator, a young girl by the name of Malinali. Malinali was able to speak both her native language and also Spanish, which was going to be really important for Cortez. And one of the things that Cortez figured out pretty early on is that the Aztec, actually, as part of their religion, had this belief that one of their gods, a god by the name of Quetzalcoatl, Quetzalcoatl was supposed to be coming back in the future, and he kind of played this to his advantage. So he kind of styled himself as if he was Quetzalcoatl returning from across the sea, which was part of the whole story. So he convinced a lot of the native peoples, including many of the Aztecs, that he was in fact a god. And as a result, many of them had a hard time fighting back. And if you think about, what it would be like to see Cortez, Cortez's skin, which was a very different color from the natives. Of course, he's from Europe, so he'd be much more European skin, much more white. He's riding around on a horse. The Aztecs, all these people of the New World, they'd never seen horses before. He's got metal armor that he wears, which was something they'd never seen before. And probably scariest, he's got guns. He's got guns and gunpowder and cannons. So it really seemed to the Aztecs like this is something otherworldly. This is something that's kind of supernatural and we've never seen before. So why couldn't it be this god Quetzalcoatl? So as a result, not only did the Aztecs not fight back for a really long time, but many of the natives, especially enemies of the Aztecs who didn't like the Aztecs, it actually helped him. And finally, Cortez kidnapped the Aztec emperor. He took hold of the city of Tenochtitlan, which, if you remember, was the Aztec capital, that big floating city on the lake. And ultimately, he destroyed the entire empire. And we're talking a very short time period. The Aztecs are going to go from the greatest empire, or at least one of the greatest empires of the New World, to absolute nothing in a matter of just a few years. Very quickly, the Aztec people are either wiped out entirely or they're enslaved, and Cortez becomes the new governor of Mexico on behalf of the Spanish. So very, very quickly, Cortez just rolls in with a very small number of troops, only a couple hundred versus the thousands of Aztecs that are there. And he takes over and topples the Aztec Empire. Now, with the Aztecs gone, you would think the rest of the New World would be pretty easy for the Spanish, but there was also another power. Remember, there's the Inca. And Cortez had never come in contact with the Inca himself, but it's actually his nephew who will. So his nephew is a guy by the name of Francisco Pizarro. He's a little bit younger than Cortez, and he kind of had grown up hearing these stories of what his uncle had done in Mexico. So, like Cortez, he was a conquistador. He's looking for wealth, and in 1532, Pizarro invades the Incan Empire. And he does this with only 160 men. Now, if you remember, the Incan Empire is ridiculously sophisticated, and they've got thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers. And here's Pizarro with 160 men. And as a way of kind of like getting the Incan emperor's attention, he starts going to these little farm villages and just destroying them and wiping out their populations. So finally, the Incan emperor says, enough is enough. I want to meet with this guy. And they meet up in a town called Cajamarcas. And Pizarro kind of comes out and he sets a trap for Atahualpa, who's the Incan emperor, and ultimately sets off a bunch of cannons and sends out his horses. And the Incas are so terrified they abandon their emperor and they run away. At which point Pizarro kidnaps the emperor, holds him hostage, demands, they give him so much gold and silver, which the Inca will do because they love their emperor. And as soon as he gets that gold and silver, he kills Atahualpa. Which very quickly leads to a massive civil war in the Incan Empire and just a whole big mess. So by the 1540s, really as a result of two men, Cortez and Pizarro, both the Aztec and the Inca are almost completely wiped out. And so these native populations that we've seen ruling the New World all of a sudden aren't ruling it anymore. And now we've got this new power in the Spanish. So let's talk about, how does this happen? How is it that a couple hundred dudes can take down the two biggest empires in the New World's history? There's a couple reasons. First and foremost, the Spanish have way better technology. I mean, the Spanish are using weapons like guns, like cannons, like steel armor. They're riding horses into battle, which is its own technology. And you compare that to the Aztecs and the Inca, who are literally using stone clubs. I mean, the Aztecs were well known for making what really looks like a cricket bat, if you guys have ever seen that. It's kind of like almost like a little paddle. And they would line the edges with obsidian glass, which was very sharp. But what's that going to do against steel armor? Nothing. It's just going to shatter. So yes, it would hurt skin, but you're not going into battle if you're a Spanish soldier. You're not going into battle with just your skin. You're going to wear some of this steel armor. So all the tricks that the Aztec and the Inca have up their sleeves, in terms of military technology, they got nothing. Absolutely nothing. Also, the Spanish got a lot of help from the native tribes because when you're a big, scary empire like the Aztecs or the Incas, you make a lot of enemies. And so when all of a sudden you have this new group who comes and they've got all this crazy tech and they're different, and they seem very interesting, like maybe even a god, whatever, you're going to jump on the bandwagon and you're going to help topple the Aztecs and the Incas, which is exactly what a lot of local groups did. So the Spanish, even though they're not many Spanish themselves, they're able to find a lot of friends in the New World. But the biggest one, the biggest thing is European diseases. And here's the thing, when we're talking about disease, anytime a disease comes through, whether it's, smallpox or bubonic plague, or honestly, eventually even this whole COVID thing, once a disease moves through a population, it'll kill the people that it's going to kill. But the people who are left behind tend to be much more immune to it. Well, sort of the same thing had been happening in Europe for generations. So Europe had dealt with smallpox time and time and time and time again, and they've dealt with things like typhus and yellow fever and malaria. I mean, all these diseases that Europe had struggled with for forever. And it was old news. Yeah, you get sick every once in a while, but it's not the end of the world. Well, once the Spanish show up in the New World, and they're bringing with them accidentally, just in the accidental spread of disease, all of a sudden, all of these Aztec, Inca, Maya, who else is in the New World, they're going to be absolutely ravaged by these diseases because they've never dealt with them before, and they've never dealt with them all at the same time. So things that the Europeans had had thousands of years to deal with, the New World is going to have to deal with like that. So there's a pretty famous number that before the Spanish conquest, there were probably about 25 million people living in North and South America. Within 100 years of Columbus getting to the New World, that number had dropped down to 1 million. So you go from 25 million to 1 million natives. That's bad. Now, the most deadly and scariest disease is smallpox. Smallpox was a pretty awful disease from the old world that caused nasty, painful blisters on the skin. Sometimes they'd pop, they'd get infected, but it was pretty fatal. There are many people who did survive smallpox. In fact, Queen Elizabeth probably survived smallpox. But for natives who don't have any exposure to this kind of thing, it's going to be pretty rough. All right, I'm going to show you guys a picture. If you're not comfortable with like gross medical-y kind of stuff, then I'm going to recommend that you just kind of like look away from the screen. I'll let you know when you can look back. But here it goes. This is kind of what smallpox does. So it causes these very nasty, painful blisters all over your body, all over your body. And again, the natives had never dealt with it, so when it tears through, it's bad. Now, fortunately, smallpox was wiped out in the 1970s, so it doesn't really threaten populations anymore. But it was a pretty nasty thing for the New World for a very long time. Alrighty, picture's gone. So let's just kind of start to wrap this up. So the Spanish begin to settle in. With all these local empires destroyed, they kind of realize, like, look, there's all this land, there's all this wealth, there's all these resources. Let's take it over. So they begin to set up these things that are called colonies, and we're going to talk more about colonies in our lesson next week. But they begin to create kind of this new form of government that we can call the encomienda system. And the encomienda system basically says the King of Spain is giving Spanish leaders who are living in the New World permission to own the land and to use the land and to also use the natives as slaves. So it's a bit like feudalism, but in the New World, where the king is giving land to these nobles, or at least these landowners, and then they get to do whatever the heck they want in order to turn a profit. So it's a pretty nasty system. It's a pretty brutal system, this encomienda system, and we're not done with it yet. We'll continue to see this moving forward. But another problem begins to happen because as the native populations are being just absolutely ravaged by these diseases, the European, particularly the Spanish, begin realizing, like, who are we going to use as slaves? We're not, white people aren't going to do all this work. So they begin to kind of look outside the box. And if all the natives are dying, well, is there a population of people from the old world who've already dealt with these diseases that could potentially be used as slaves? And unfortunately, this is also about the same time that Africa began to have a whole lot of warfare and a whole lot of issues, and it became a very easy target for Europeans, first the Portuguese and then the Spanish and then a number of other groups, to move in and actually demand African people for use as slaves. And so this will become what we call the transatlantic slave trade, which again we'll get to next week, but this becomes a problem. So now we're not just exploiting natives. Now we're also importing slaves from Africa and abusing them as well. So Spain's takeover of the New World is a great example of what we can call colonization. So colonization is creating an area of control outside of the mother country. So it's almost like creating a little mini country that's still tied to the old country, but elsewhere, away from home. And most of the time, these colonies need a strong connection with the mother country in order to survive because they're not a full country. They're like a little baby country, but they're there pretty much to make money and wealth and resources for mama country back home. So a colony then is a territory established and controlled by a mother country. So I'm sure you guys are aware, the United States was once the 13 colonies, which were 13 separate colonies that were all controlled by Britain. And then we finally broke away and we lost that colony status and we became our own country. And many of these colonies will do the same. But a number of different regions in Europe begin to colonize other regions of the New World. So if you take a look at the map that I've got there, that gold color that runs pretty much from Oregon all the way down to like Argentina, in Chile, that's the Spanish. So the Spanish control a huge chunk of the New World. That like puke green, gross color of Brazil, that's the Portuguese. But then you can see there's that lighter green of the French. The French will take over a lot of land, especially in North America. In fact, Watkins Glen was once part of a French colony called New France. And then you've also got that pink color there. That's the British turf. So you've got the 13 colonies, but you've also got a lot more land up in Canada. Particularly around the Hudson Bay. And then you'll have a smattering of other countries, like the Danish will take a chunk, so the Dutch will have a piece. The Russians will have a small piece, particularly up in Alaska, which we'll buy from them in the 1900s. But all these different countries are trying to grab hold of this new world for the purposes of trying to gain resources and trying to gain more wealth. So what starts to develop then is this brand new culture in this region. So from what is today Mexico on southward, we really begin to see this new type of culture develop. We've got this mix of Native American culture, we've got a little bit of European culture, and then we've also got some African stuff as well. Most of the languages that we see in this region of the world are either Portuguese or Spanish. And if you remember when we talked about the Romantic languages, these languages that will spawn out of the Roman language of Latin, this is what we're talking about. So both Portuguese and Spanish are Latin-based languages, and so it's for this reason that today we tend to call Central and South America Latin America, not because they speak Latin, but because they speak languages that developed out of Latin. So Latin America is just the Spanish and Portuguese speaking region of the New World. Again, it's Mexico on southward. So anything that's south of the US border, we usually call that Latin America. Now, not only are these going to be predominantly Portuguese or Spanish speaking, especially Spanish speaking, but thanks to the Jesuits, who, if you remember, were out there sharing the Christian message after Martin Luther, they played a really big part in establishing Catholic Christianity as the main religion in Latin America, and it continues to be the main religion in Latin America today. So in a lot of South America, Central America, Mexico, Ecuador, Peru, Argentina, whatever, Catholic Christianity is a very, very big deal in that region. And then we'll just wrap up here because we'll come back to this idea, and you guys will definitely see this again next year when you're in 10th grade. But not only are we creating a new culture in Latin America, we're also creating a new society. And within Latin American society, power depended way more on race than it did on anything else. So it wasn't necessarily about your wealth or whatnot. It was what color was your skin. So we start to see this new pyramid of power that's based on racism, essentially. So the group that's at the top, we call them the Peninsulares. And the Peninsulares come from the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, which is where we find Portugal and Spain. So the people who are off the boat directly from Spain and Portugal, they're going to have the most power in the New World. So these Peninsulares. Now there's a group that's right underneath them that's also white, and we call them the Creoles. And the Creoles are going to be the children of Peninsulares, but they were born in the New World. And by virtue of the fact that they were born in the New World, they're going to be just a smidge down. So the Peninsulares are the ones who are running the show, and then you've got those Creoles. But then things start to get mixed, because then you've got a group called the Mestizos and another one called the Mulattoes. Now the Mestizos and the Mulattoes, these are mixed races. So the Mestizos would be half European, half Native American, and the Mulattoes would be half European, half African. And because they weren't full-blooded Europeans, they're the next step down. Now they're not as bad off as, say, the slaves will be, but they're going to be the next rung on this. So then we go to the African slaves, who of course are going to be brought over as the natives are dying, and then all the way at the bottom you have the native slaves, who really sort of get a raw deal within this new society that's being created. So you've got the white peninsulares, the white Creoles, the mixed mestizos and mulattoes, and then you have the darker skinned African and native slaves. And so this is the new society that's developing, not for the better, but it's developing within the New World at this time within Latin America. So as the Spanish have pushed through, they've created a brand new continent, but it's going to cause some problems. So we'll pick up on this again next week. Make sure you answer those questions. If you have any issues that you want to bring up with me, feel free. Otherwise, we will see you guys then. Bye.